In the summer of 1940, history hung in the balance. Hitler's armies had conquered Poland, Norway, Holland, and Belgium in quick succession. Next, the Nazi blitzkrieg overwhelmed France, and the British army were forced to retreat from Dunkirk. Now Adolf Hitler stood, just as Napoleon had stood, more than 100 years before, and looked across the English Channel to the one fighting obstacle that stood between him and world domination. A tiny island, Great Britain. The preliminaries were over. It was time for the main event. July 16th, 1940. Adolf Hitler issued Directive 16, the order to prepare an invasion of Great Britain.
I have decided to prepare a landing operation against England and, if necessary, to carry it out. The aim of this operation will be to eliminate the English homeland as a base for the prosecution of the war against Germany, and, if necessary, to occupy it completely.
Hitler spent the next 6 weeks planning the invasion and occupation of Britain. It was codenamed Operation Sea Lion, and Hitler knew that if the Nazis could obtain air superiority, then they could launch an invasion. During August and September, the Luftwaffe fought the Royal Air Force over southern England. But on September 15th, the Germans lost the Battle of Britain, and the invasion was cancelled. All that remained of Hitler's dream for Britain were these plans. Using these actual Nazi blueprints for the invasion and occupation of England, it is possible to construct an alternative history of life in Britain under the Nazi jackboot. In this film, we imagine what would happen if Hitler's dream had become a reality. Welcome to Hitler's Britain.
15th September 1940. Nazi Germany wins the Battle of Britain. For the last 6 weeks, the Luftwaffe have been dogfighting with the Royal Air Force over southern England. First, they knocked out the radar stations, airfields and factories. Next, they took on the fighters until there were no fighters left.
Y de zurda cruza Manny Ryan para poner esto en orden, para poner esto bajo control. Al 20 es el tercero en la Copa del Mundo para Arjen Robben. 1-0 lo gana Holanda. A 0, Balboa.
Qué golazo, ¿no? Y viste ahí, Wilkinson lo quería tirar. Le quería hacer una falta, no le hizo la falta y ahí es donde se fue Robben. Solito ahí se fue en un golazo que solo metió ahí la esquina.
Over the English Channel, the Nazis are ready to launch Operation Sea Lion. 21st September, 10,000 German paratroopers land on the south coast of England. The Home Guard are no match for these elite troops, and the port of Dover is captured. The Nazi stormtroopers have a foothold on Britain, and they're here to stay. 22nd September, 80,000 soldiers and 4,000 panzer tanks cross the English Channel. They land in 3 waves on a wide front, and before the British can react, the Nazis secure a beachhead. 23rd September. The British Army launch a counterattack, but fleeing civilians, a lack of artillery, and harassment by the Luftwaffe drive them into retreat. Central London is destroyed in a massive air raid. Winston Churchill is killed by a direct hit on the war rooms. The nation mourns, whilst the advancing Germans seem unstoppable. The remnants of the British Army, along with the government, flee to Worcester to make a final stand. The royal family are evacuated to Canada. This November, German troops march into London. The last beacon of freedom is extinguished in Europe. Adolf Hitler reigns supreme.
This is fiction, but it is based on hard facts. This was the precise sequence of events that was envisaged by the Germans in the summer of 1940. These are the actual handwritten plans made by Hitler and Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch for the invasion of Britain. Hitler was so confident the operation would be a success that he actually named Marshal von Brauchitsch as the military commander-in-chief of occupied Britain. Von Brauchitsch was ordered to produce a strategy to tame the British people in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. Von Brauchitsch had successfully quelled the population of Poland by ordering his troops to brutally rape, pillage, and murder the Poles. But in France, he adopted a more subtle strategy, and his most disciplined troops were posted to Paris, where they were famously polite and even kind to the French citizens. So what would life be like for the people of Britain with Marshal von Brauchitsch in charge? The Channel Islands were invaded in July 1940, the only piece of British territory that was occupied by the Nazis during the war. The islands of Guernsey, Jersey, Alderney, and Sark lie closer to France than Britain. The Germans saw them as a stepping stone to invading England. So on July 1st, 1940, the Nazis occupied the undefended islands.
I was looking by the window, and then these three German officers were coming up Millville Road where I lived, and disobeyed my father, and I followed them, round Rouge-Bouillon, down the parade where the cenotaphers, and there's all the Germans sitting there, with the machine gun belts round their neck, hand grenades stuck in their boots, the usual old stuff. A couple of girls chatting them up, I thought, well, that's the sort of the occupation.
Well, we were frightened at the time, very much so. But gradually, as we saw the Germans passing along the roads, we just accepted them and had to accept them.
Within a matter of days, the Germans had moved approximately 1,500 troops in. They'd occupied the post office, the town hall, the centres of communication, and had started shopping.
The Channel Islanders were terrified by the German army's reputation, but their fears were unfounded.
They actually took their place in shopping queues. They bought things, they paid for money. They didn't just simply go into Woolworths, say, and clear the shelves. They actually queued up and paid.
They saw things in our shops that they probably hadn't seen for years in their own country. Of course, they went mad and buying this and buying that, and of course, very soon there was nothing else to buy.
It was a most bizarre situation. The Germans, remember, were, as far as they were concerned, in transit. This was merely a stepping stone to their invasion of Britain.
Cahill le mete, ya son dos veces, no dos goles que le mete, pero increíble, del aire le pega, mira, entre medio de tres jugadores de Holanda, ¿cómo puede ser que le dejen solito al único que tiene chance de hacer un gol? La verdad, un error grande de Holanda, pero qué golazo de Tim Hale.
Es un diamante en bruto el centro, para empezar.
Themselves on the Channel Islands, and we know that the situation would have been the same in occupied Britain. The evidence is a document called The Guide for Troops in Occupied England, written by Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch in July 1940.
A firm and cautious attitude towards the civilian population is to be adopted. The death sentence may be imposed for acts of violence against orderly members of the population or for looting. Any private purchases by individual soldiers are to be paid for in cash. The rate of exchange will be £1 English for 9.6 Reichsmark.
But this was just the beginning of Hitler's plans for Britain.
November 4th, 1940. Sporadic fighting continues around the government stronghold in Worcester, but in London a strange calm reigns over the city. Marshal von Brauchitz's well-disciplined troops have spent the last 2 weeks clearing up the capital, and British shopkeepers are making record profits. It seems as if the Nazis are trying to charm the British into submission.
But charm was just the first part of von Brauchitz's strategy. As well as his guide for troops in Britain, in July 1940, he issued the most secret directive for the military government in England. This document outlined the second part of his strategy. Behind the velvet glove lay an iron fist.
November 1940. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitz, military commander of Great Britain, orders the deportation of almost 2 million prisoners of war to camps on the continent. Whilst wives, mothers and children weep, the men are taken to specially prepared camps outside Paris, where they will remain as hostages for the duration of the war.
Why was this going to be done? Well, I think one has to look at the situation in occupied France, which had fallen the month before, because there, nearly 2 million men of roughly between those ages had been based in prisoner of war camps in Germany, and their sort of treatment could be used as a lever. Play along with us and the prisoners will receive good treatment. Don't do what we say, don't collaborate, and the prisoners will suffer.
November 18th. Dr. Franz Six arrives in London. He is accompanied by the elite Einsatzkommandos England. This is the secret Nazi death squad assigned to Great Britain. Over the next 2 weeks they will kill more than 2,000 people in an operation that Dr. Six has been planning for more than 3 months.
Dr. Franz Six was typical of the sort of people that ran these task forces, in the sense that he was a sort of ex-hack journalist who'd somehow or other, because of his politics, managed to become a professor at a good university, but even that wasn't enough for him. So he's a sort of typical demi-educated graduate, and these people were utterly ruthless and without scruple, and had he, judging by what his colleagues did in other countries, I mean, the slightest provocation, he would have been let loose on parts of the British population and would have done God knows what.
Dr. Franz Six had been a fervent Nazi since 1933 and had used his connections to obtain a high-ranking position at Berlin's university. Here, he used his pseudo-academic credentials to justify the Nazi policy of eliminating their enemies. Having proved his loyalty, in July 1940, Dr. Six was appointed as the higher police leader for Great Britain. His orders came directly from Reinhard Heydrich, head of the German Security Service. Nicknamed the Blonde Beast by the Nazis, Heydrich was the most feared man in occupied Europe, and these were his instructions.
Your task is to combat all anti-German organizations, institutions and opposition groups in England.
Dr. Six immediately began assembling his team. The documents he wrote have now been translated for the first time, and they paint a terrifying picture of his plans for Britain. In this file, he describes precisely how his elite death squad would operate. Six intended to set up his headquarters in London. The cities of Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, and Bristol would each have their own task force. Dr. Six even assigned specialists to handle different groups such as Freemasons, Marxists, liberals, and Jews. Dr. Six spent almost a month training his team of murderers at a secret location. On August 8th, 1940, he wrote this letter to Heydrich.
Gruppenführer, the preparations for the Einsatzgroup for England are complete. Classes in practical English have been given and have been rounded off with a few hours of pistol and machine gun shooting. Signed, Dr. Six.
It's very interesting that there was a task force, one of the Einsatzgruppen, formed and assigned to deal with England, because one knows what they did when similar units followed the troops into Poland in September 1939. They did round up large numbers of people who they thought were the social elite, and they murdered them. They just took them out to a forest or something and shot them down.